All right, so here we are moving along in Goethe's Faust. And so now, in this video, what I want to do is discuss this speech, this sort of to be or not to be speech, this Hamlet-type speech now, that after Wagner leaves, Goethe in 1799, thereabouts 99 to 1800, inserts here for the rest of this section, plus the Easter sunrise, which in a sense resurrects him. And so here there's another painting of him brooding, deflated and depressed yet again. And in this speech, he will consider suicide. And so he says, after Wagner leaves, how does the mind sustain some hope and pleasure that's stuck forever to the same old terms, with greedy fingers grubbing after treasure and gratified to dig up worms? That's where the Faust scene ended, and then now the 1799 version continues. May such a human accent here resound, where all about was spirit, wealth, and worth? Alas, this once, though, I am bound to thank you, poorest of the sons of earth. You banished the despair that held me fast, that was about to overthrow my mind. And he's talking about the earth spirit here and its apparition. Alas, the apparition was so vast, it showed me all too well my dwarfish kind. It was too much for him. And recall initially that it was inflation, then followed by deflation. In both cases, the macrocosm on the one hand and the earth spirit on the other. And then he says, I, Godhead's likeness, who had sword in mind, close to the mirror of eternal verity. Self-relishing in heaven's radiant clarity, the son of earth quite left behind. That may be an allusion to the macrocosm, the soaring into the realm of truth. I more than cherub, whose free energy foreboding dared through nature's veins to flow, and through creation joyously to know God-like estate, must I now rue it so? A thunder word rang out and withered me. No, I may not presume to be your equal. While I had strength to draw you here, the sequel, the strength to hold you, was denied me. That fleeting moment of high bliss, and note how Goethe is constantly cleverly making little allusions forwards and backwards to plot developments and events, where he says, the fleeting moment of high bliss. That fleeting moment is what the wager will be that he makes with Mephistopheles, to find that moment of high bliss and see if he could find such a moment that would make it last forever. He says, I felt myself so small, so great, until you thrust me merciless back to uncertain human fate. Who teaches me? What should I shun? That urge I feel, should I obey? Both what we do and what we suffer to be done, alas, impedes us on life's way. So he's pretty depressed here. And as we go down the verses here, he says, not like the gods am I, profoundly it is rude. I'm of the earthworm's dust-engendered brood, which, blindly burrowing by dust is fed, and crushed and buried by the wanderer's tread. And so we do have, in the imagery in these next few scenes, we do have this opposition between the burrowing earthworm, which in a way alludes then back to the earth spirit, this sort of almost not even human mentality of earth burrowing, versus the bird with the wings spread and the flight, which will become the two souls that he talks about with Wagner when he's on his Easter walk. And he says, you only have one soul, Wagner. You're stuck with the earth. I have two souls, not just the earthworm. And he was making fun here as Wagner left, talking about him being gratified to just dig up earthworms. And then in the Easter walk, in the next scene here, after this, he'll say, you only have the one soul. You don't have the visionary soul. You can't grow wings and have the urge to fly and dream. And so these are also these two souls in Faust. And in a way, it's prefigured by the macrocosm on the one hand and the microcosm or the earth spirit on the other. But it also plays itself out with this two types of seeing, two ways of seeing the world. The visionary way, which is the grand way, the macrocosmic way, versus the merely mundane way, which poor Wagner is stuck with because he's a prosaic academic who has no imagination. And then now he notices a skull up on one of his shelves. And just as this speech is in Goethe dialoguing with the Hamlet speech of to be or not to be in Hamlet, so too at the end of that play, when Hamlet returns after Ophelia has committed suicide and he has returned back to England, and he comes into the graveyard where the grave digger is digging up a grave. I think it's for Ophelia. It's Ophelia's grave, I believe. And then he sees a skull there and picks it up, and it's Yorick the jester's skull, and he remembers Yorick entertaining him when he was a child. And he says, where are your jobs now? What's happened to you? Where have you gone? And so Goethe alludes to that here, where he notices the skull, and he says, these 100 shelves, is it not dust that bent their lofty wall into a cell which stifles? A universe of moths where I am pent into a dustbin with 1,000 trifles. There's the moth, that winged thing again, which starts as a worm and then becomes a moth. So that opposition there too. Goethe is always playing with the language and constantly reiterating the themes in microcosm, in momentary flashing images, the grand themes of this opposition between the two souls. Here would I find the thing I lack? Am I to plow 1,000 books to read of man at all times, stretched upon a rack, and here and there one happy one, indeed? How, grinning skull. So he's looking at his books on the shelves there, and in this painting we see an animal skull in the background, but it should really be a human skull. How, grinning hollow skull, well you may leer to think that once your brain, like this one here, in murky bondage sought the easeful day, and parched with thirst for truth went grievously astray. So he thinks he's gone astray, even though he's one of the most learned men, let's say, in Germany at this time. And he says, then he turns to this idea of the vanity of technology, and he notices one of these machines, one of these instruments that his father, who was a physician, who Goethe invents the idea that he and his father his father was a healer, a medicine man, who saved the town from a plague. Previously, his father's gone. But there was this machine here. He says, you instruments, you mock me, I can see, with wheel and pulley, cylinder and cords. I face to the gate. You were to be the key, but cannot lift the bolts however shrewd your wards. Mysterious in bright daylight, never will nature be defrauded of her veil. What to your spirit she reveal not, that you fail to torture out of her with screw or lever. And that's, of course, a reference to Francis Bacon's idea that what science does to nature is to put her on the rack and torture her secrets from her. And so Goethe's alluding to that, and he realizes you can only torture so many secrets out of her, you're not going to get all of them. You're never going to fully lift her veil, like lifting the veil of Isis in the temple at Sais, where she says, I am past, I am present, I am future, I am Isis, none may lift my veil. She is, of course, time, and time is the veil of eternity, which cannot ever fully be lifted. You ancient gear I never used, you loom about here just because my father worked you. And then he turns to the desk and the writing, and so it shifts as sort of from technology to media studies, and he looks at the books, and he says, you ancient scroll, you have been cured with fume, while at this desk the feeble lamp bemirked you. Far better to have squandered free of care my pittance than to sweat withal and scoff it. What you received but as your father's heir, make it your own to gain possession of it. What is unused is ballast hard to bear. Alone what moment has begot can yield it profit. So he's totally disillusioned with books and learning, technology. He realizes that it's gotten him nowhere, all this book learning, just as it's gotten Wagner nowhere. And indeed, these characters, Wagner, Mephistopheles, many of them are mirrors of different aspects of this character of Faust. Wagner mirrors Faust's stuffy, stale, bookworm, being a bookworm, whereas Mephistopheles will mirror his lower amoral, carnal nature when he shows up, first in the black dog, significantly as the dog symbolizes man's lower nature, what Rudolf Steiner calls the astral body, the passions and desires of the astral body. And then he notices a vial of poison up on one of the shelves now. He says, why is that spot there riveting my glances? Is that small flask a magnet to my sight? A sudden lovely gleam my soul entrances, like moonlight wafting through the woods at night. And so as often happens when people commit, or before they commit suicide, it's often said that they have an inflation. Now they've found the answer. This is the answer. And suddenly it cheers them up. They start giving their stuff away. Suicide looks like an optimistic way out to one who is so sunk in depression as Faust is here. And then he says, I bid you greeting, vile unique, which now with veneration I fetch down. In you I reverence of human wit the peak, of gracious slumber saps the inmost flower. quintessence of all subtly lethal power. Prove to your lord your favor and renown. I see you, and the agony decreases. I grasp you, and the striving half releases its hold. The spirit's flood tide ebbs betimes. Out to the open sea am I directed, its mirror flood bright at my feet reflected, and day new dawning lures me to new climes. So remember, this is Holy Saturday. He's been up all night now, and the sun on Easter Sunday is beginning to rise. Now notice this here. As the sun approaches, he calls it, a fiery chariot, wings on pinions light, approaches. I am ready. I feel free to cleave the ether on a novel flight, to novel spheres of pure activity, such lofty life, such godly benison. You but a worm as yet, deserve it, you? With firm resolve, then, turn your back upon this lovely son of earth, the sun you knew. So now, ironically, as the sun rises on Easter morning, which should be a symbol of hope and optimism and resurrection, for him is a symbol of death. And at this point, he turns his back on it, as he is getting ready to descend into the darkness of death as he drinks down this poison. And then, compare this Easter Sunday, and then he goes out with Wagner in the next scene on a stroll all day, gets out, gets a breath of fresh air, and then he has to contrast this scene with the rising sun with the setting sun scene on Easter Day, where Faust has this inflationary fantasy that's almost like Icarus, that's like flying and following the sun around the earth, which is a major inflationary fantasy. Here is Matthias Grunewald's interesting representation of Christ's resurrection, and Christ here on Easter Day, they go back to the tomb and they find it empty. And here's why, because Christ has been resurrected. And Grunewald deliberately paints it like the sun, as though Christ were a newborn son rising up out of the darkness in the resurrection. And so that's the image here that Goethe wants to convey. And so he's just about to drink the flask of the chalice. It's described as a chalice, and it's meant ironically to refer to the chalice of the Last Supper that Christ drank from. And then he hears the sound of bells. The cathedral nearby is ringing the church bells, announcing Easter, and they're performing a medieval Latin plain song, a kind of cantata, like a Bach cantata, on the inside, where we get a chorus of angels and singing Christ is arisen, joy to the mortal, him whom invidious, subtle, insidious blemishes prisoned. So he's come up out of his prison, just as for Faust, as we'll see here, the prison has been here, the Gothic high vaulted chamber that he is emerging out of at this moment, and will be a risen son as he walks on Easter Day in the bright daylight with all the other people who have come out of their crypts, their jobs, their shops, their work, their houses, to be resurrected on Easter Day, freed of all that burden. And so we have a chorus of angels, then a chorus of women, and then a chorus of disciples. So we have angels, women, and disciples all singing in this cantata inside this nearby church of the resurrected Christ, which is meant, of course, to mirror the trifold opening in the prologue in heaven that begins with the sun, with Raphael singing hymns and praises to the sun, then down to Gabriel, who introduces the polarity of darkness and light, then down to Michael, who introduces the other elements. Earth, air, fire, and water are all mentioned by him as it comes down to the earthly plane with Mephistopheles. And so this stops Faust for now and pulls him temporarily out of his depression, so that by the next scene, outside the city gate, people of all sorts are coming out for walks, and Goethe spends a couple of pages here on all these peasant folks running around, laughing, having fun, and there's lots of erotic talk, and that's the key thing about this scene. Goethe's preparing you for the activation of Faust's eros as he goes after Gretchen, which is the first thing that he goes after, and the first thing that the Faust character in all the versions goes after is the female sex. And here it is out on Easter Day, the women and the young girls and the young men flirting with each other, lots of sexual innuendos going on. And here in this painting by Ebert, I think from the middle of the 19th century, you can see Faust walking in the center there in a black robe, still looking rather down, and Wagner cheerfully walking beside him. Wagner's a bit naive. And at first, when Faust is walking, he does seem to be quite cheered up. Goethe compares him here with that sunrise, and he says, And he's looking around at him, and he's in a good mood. It's cured him of his depression. He says, from these folk in their finery do instead turn around with me, look down from these lofty hillsides back toward town. He's telling this to Wagner as they walk. See how the gate's dark cave exudes teeming, colorful multitudes. All seek the sun with glad accord. They exult in the rising of the Lord. For they are resurrected themselves, freed from the shackles of shops and crafts, from stuffy dwellings like narrow shelves, just like he has been freed here temporarily from his stuffy dwelling, from smothering roofs and gable lofts, from the city streets with their smothering press, from out the church's reverend night. They have all been raised to light. Look, look how nimbly the human crest breaks and surges through field and park, how the length and width of the river's breast cradles many a pleasure bark, and so on. He's enjoying it. He's having a good time. Everybody it's a cheerful atmosphere. And then he stops near some peasants who are hanging out under a linden tree. Now, a linden tree, and I'm sure that Goethe knew this, is one of the old symbols of the linden tree is that it has to do with healing. It may have a medicinal property, which I suspect that it does. And it's under the tree that Faust stops, and he sings a little song, probably does a little jig, embarrasses Wagner a bit. But then all these peasants start coming up to him, and they start thanking him and his now dead father for saving so many of the town members during a recent plague. His father was a physician, and Faust is a little bit embarrassed by it, and he doesn't know how to take it. And Wagner says, how great that must feel to have the town come up. Doesn't that make you feel good to have these town members come up to you and thank you for saving their lives? And then Faust discusses his father, and here we get let's see, lines 1021, 1022, all the way down the page, we get the first references to alchemy. And this is, as Jung has pointed out, it is an alchemical opus, Goethe's Faust. Goethe knew alchemy very well. He had studied it. And it is itself an alchemical opus. And as Rudolf Steiner remarks, that medicine was practiced in the 13th and 14th centuries, and also in the 15th and even in the 16th, as late as the 16th, which is Faust's time here, in terms of the 1480 to 1540 is when he inhabited Wittenberg. And medicine was not differentiated from alchemy. If you practiced medicine, you had to know alchemy, because alchemy taught you what elixirs to create by mixing this chemical with that chemical. So you had to know both, and the two were very well intertwined. And also, as Steiner says, there's another thing to consider here, is that Faust has one foot into two different worlds. The one is the world that is dying out, the world of medieval magic and sorcery, but also an understanding of the traditions, the mystery traditions and the magical traditions, and how they worked, and that they worked. In the 13th and 14th centuries, with alchemy intertwined with magic. But by the time of the historical Faust, who lived 1480 to 1540, he was living at a time in which already that world was crumbling and falling apart, and the type of magic that he would have practiced would have been a degenerate form of it. It's a little like Gene Gebser talking about the magical consciousness structure, and he says that it enters its deficient phase, not its efficient phase, but its deficient phase when it resorts to black magic and spell casting. And Goethe refers to this in Faust's speech here, where he says, where he's talking about his father. He says, "My father, man of honor though unsung, brooded on nature with a crotchety passion, and in all probity, yet in his fashion, upon her sacred circles raptly hung, by secret recipes unending." And so let's bring in this image of the alchemist here. Joseph Wright of Derby's image of an alchemist in his lab, because alchemy is a very important theme running through this epic. Locked up in the black kitchen with retorts. The black kitchen is an allusion to black magic. He brewed away with adepts, as this alchemist here has a couple of adepts in the background there, blending contrariness of every sort. There was a scarlet lion, and the scarlet lion is a symbol for mercury oxide, intrepid wooer, wed to the lily in a tepid ewer, and the lily represents hydrochloric acid. So you could mix mercury oxide and hydrochloric acid in order to produce whatever the distillation was going to be, the specific, as it was called, whatever it's going to be, to be prescribed. And when you mix two different substances, they were often personified as the marriage of two different substances to produce a third, which was whatever you were going to prescribe to the patient. And then by open flames, the two were vexed from one new bridal chamber to the next. And when at last, with rainbow colors vying, and the rainbow colors are a kind of spectrum that's produced from the chemical explosion or whatever it is, which is known as the cauda pavonis in alchemy, which is the peacock's tail. And it's a symbol of rebirth, just as the rainbow appears in the Old Testament after God drowns man with the flood and sends the rainbow as a covenant, also symbolizes rebirth there. The young queen glistened in the yield. There was your dose. The patients went on dying, and nobody inquired who was healed. And thus, with our infernal tonic upon these hills, these dales we visited a plague far worse than the bubonic. Why, with this poison I myself defrauded men by the thousands, leaving them for dead. Now I must hear the brazen killers lauded. And so, once again, with his mood, he always has to see the negative in everything. And instead of being happy that these townsfolk are coming up to him and thanking him for saving so many lives, him and his father, he remembers how many people they also killed with giving them the wrong potions and specifics. So he can only think of the glass, half empty at this point. That's just his attitude. And Wagner says, "Why feel so bitterly disgusted? Come, does an honest man do ill, pursuing with good faith and will the art with which he was entrusted? If you revere your father as a youth, you will accept from him with pleasure. If as a man you swell the store of truth, your son may grow to yet more lofty measure." And so for once, Wagner has a point here. Come out of your self-pity. That's ridiculous. This is getting old. But then now Faust has another inflation here in this wonderful speech that he gives, which is kind of a monologue, but it's not, because he's talking to Wagner. And he's looking at the sun is setting now. So he looks at the sun, and here for illustration, I've chosen the 80s sci-fi fantasy artist Boris Vallejo, whose son Dorian Vallejo, I'm good friends. His painting of Icarus chasing the sun, which is basically what Faust is doing here. As he looks up at the sun, in his imagination, he imagines what it would be like to chase it, to be able to grow wings and fly and chase it around the planet so he could see the planet from orbit. And in this respect, it's almost as though Goethe were foreseeing the coming of satellite technology, or at least, air flight, most certainly. And this epic is pregnant with lots of prescient foresight on Goethe's part to the technological transformations that were on the way. And just to read a bit of it here, he says, "Oh, that I have no buoyant wings to flourish, to strive and follow on and on. I'd see an endless vesper raise the silent world beneath me glowing, the valleys all appeased, each hill ablaze, the silver brooks to golden rivers flowing. No more would then this rugged bluff deny with cliff and precipice the godlike motion. Already with its sun-warmed bays the ocean reveals itself to the astonished eye. At last it seems the god is downward sinking, yet to new urge awakes the mind. I hasten on, his ceaseless radiance drinking. The day ahead of me, night left behind, the waves below, and overhead the sky. A happy fancy. Meanwhile he must pass. To spirit wings will scarce be joined, alas, corporeal wings wherewith to fly. Yet it is innate in us all that feeling ever upward, forward presses, when, lost above in heaven's azure spaces, the skylark trills his jubilant call. When over craggy fir-clad highlands, on outspread wings the eagle rides, and striving over plains and islands, the crane toward his homeland glides." And this is the Faustian spirit here. That's why the Faust myth is totally different from the story of Prometheus. This is the myth of growing wings and flying that Leonardo, who was a contemporary of the historical Faust, was in the south dreaming of, drawing out designs for possible flying contraptions. Leonardo was busy thinking out the future, as Goethe was here several centuries later, thinking out the future. And poor prosaic Wagner, the unimaginative, dull academic who gets left behind by the visionary imagination, says, "I too have been to moody crotchets given. By such an urge, though, I was never driven. The charm in watching woods and fields is brief. I never shall begrudge the bird its soaring. Compare the mind's delights which wing us, pouring from book to book, from leaf to leaf." So he says, I've never envied the bird flight, which is why you'll never invent flight, Wagner, which is why you will never go to the moon. You and your like, your ilk, will never dream us to the moon, will never dream us into airplanes around the earth. that have the effect of shrinking the earth down to the size of a marble, a little plaything, a globe, a child's toy. All of these distance annihilating technologies have reduced it to. And then Faust says, pityingly, "You are by just a single urge possessed. Oh, may you never know the other." And then he says, two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, and either would be severed from its brother. The one holds fast," and this is Wagner. So now we're back to the two souls. We're back to the macrocosm versus the earth spirit. We're back to the two ways of seeing, prosaically and in a visionary manner that is full of dreams. The one holds fast with joyous earthy lust onto the world of man with organs clinging. That's the earth spirit. That's Wagner. The other, however, soars impassioned from the dust to realms of lofty forebears winging. Oh, be there spirits in the air who twixt the earth and heaven reigning hover. Descend ye from the golden fragrance there, to new and changeful living lead me over. Then he says, "Why, if a magic cape were only mine, and were to bear me over alien borders, I'd trade it not for choicest robes and orders, nor for the royal cloak and carnity." It's interesting that he thinks of a magic cloak that would enable him to fly, because that's exactly what happens with Superman when Superman is invented by Siegel and Schuster in the 1930s, with this magic cape that enables him to fly. But in the Eastern tales, let's say in the Arabian Nights, it wouldn't be a cape, it would be a magic carpet that would enable the heroes to fly. Interesting here how Goethe has the magic cape, and I'm not sure where he's gotten it from or what he's referring it to, but it's in a way pregnant with the coming of the comic book superhero, starting with Superman, whose cape enables him to fly in a symbolic way. And then Wagner invokes, he's like, well, if you went up and flew, there would be all these weather spirits that would assault you from the four different directions, from the north, from the orient or the east, from noon, and from the west. All four different directions of the compass, you would put yourself in danger of these weather spirits, these atmospheric spirits that would assault you. And so Wagner keeps trying to shoot down Faust's balloon and bring him down to the earth. And then so finally we'll conclude here with the black poodle that shows up. Faust is noticing a black poodle that has been circling them. And here is Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini marriage. A black poodle has been circling them in spirals, getting closer and closer. And Faust says, "Hey, see that black dog through seed and fallow roaming?" Wagner, "I saw it long before and paid it little heed." Faust, "Look at it well. What would you call its breed?" Wagner, "A poodle, I should say, with canine snooping at pains upon its master's trail." And then Faust says, "Do you observe him near and nearer, looping a narrowing spiral like the convolute snail?" Almost invokes the Fibonacci sequence at this point. "Unless I err, there arises in his track a swirling, fiery effusion." So note the difference here. Once again, we get an illustration of the two different ways of seeing. The prosaic, earthly way of seeing, all Wagner sees is a dog, contrasted with the visionary way of seeing, the macrocosmic way of seeing of Faust, who is able to see it through the eye of vision. He sees that it's a spiritual being, trailing a swirling, fiery effusion. So we get the contrast once again between the two. And Wagner says, "I see a poodle, and I see it's black. Yours must have been some optical illusion." Faust says, "He seems to snare our feet with magic, weaving some future bondage, thread by stealthy thread." And it's important that it's a black dog. First of all, the dog, this is Mephistopheles' first appearance in the narrative. He just shows up while they're out wandering. Almost as though Faust's depression has called him forth, and in a way it has. And it's black because it's a reference to the Negrito phase of alchemy. Recall that we began with night, Faust alone in a high, narrow, Gothic chamber, brooding in the infinite space of his own transcendental ego, the Faustian ego. And it began with night, and then here Faust went without sleep, brooding on suicide for the entire night. Then we saw the sunrise. Now it's setting, and we're moving into night again. We've come back full circle with a black dog, but it's also a deliberate reference to the Negrito phase of alchemy, where the metals are melted down, they're blackened. And then also the fact that it is a dog, because a dog in mythology, in all the world's mythologies, is associated with the underworld. Cerberus, that guards the gate to the underworld, is the dog with 3 heads, owned by Pluto. There's a dog in Indian mythology. The god of the underworld is named Yama, and he has, I believe, 2 dogs. And also the god of the underworld in Chinese mythology has a dog as well. The dog is always the underworld animal because it leads you down into the underworld. And indeed, when Mephistopheles shows up, he is about to be taken on a journey through the underworld. But also, and I have Jan van Eyck's painting here because the symbolism is somewhat the same as in Faust here, where the dog represents our earthly passions and desires. And that's what Mephistopheles is. That's what he is, incarnate in the dog. Faust's own carnal desires, and desires for what Rudolf Steiner calls the rooted in the astral body, which has to do with our passions and desires, and it's what we share in common with the animal element. But in the Arnolfini marriage here, we get the marriage here, which may have alchemical illusions. Now that I think about it, now that I'm looking about it, Van Eyck's paintings are full of esoteric symbolism underneath all the Christian imagery. And then the chandelier up above, notice that there's only one candle that's lit, and that is the candle of the spirit. That is, it's like Joyce's opposition in Ulysses between God and dog. They are 2 opposites at the end of the spectrum, and of course, the light represents the word, the logos, which we'll see Faust trying to translate in a bit here. The word, the logos, which is the light of human reason and language. Heidegger's language is what separates the human being. In Heidegger's essay, there's an abyss of difference between the human and the animal. The human being isn't just an animal with reason tacked on. It isn't that. That's not the case. Rudolf Steiner agrees with him in his commentary on Faust, where he says, yes, the word, the logos, that Faust starts degrading with his mistranslations, was there in the beginning and represents the faculty, that which humans have that animals do not have, namely what he calls the ego, but he means it in a larger sense than the merely prosaic Freud and Jungian ego. The human ego, which is the monad for him, that transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime for Steiner, and it possesses language. And language and the ego that's the thing for Steiner that separates the human from the animal. And also, the way Steiner reads this, as we'll see in the next video, in the opposition between the dog and the spirit, that Faust wants to go through spiritual evolution. He wants to pursue the transformations of the spirit into larger and larger horizons. But Mephistopheles, within the dog, who comes out of the dog, represents that which is an adversary to human spiritual evolution, namely getting entangled in the material world, getting entangled in the merely animal drives of lust and power and territoriality and all the problems that being incarnate in a material animalistic body brings along with it, that distracts us from the larger task that we're participating in, which is human spiritual evolution. Okay, so with that, we'll leave it there for that video.